Every single employee at Blackthorne Mobility received an invitation to the massive celebration. Every single person except Nolan Pierce, while the CEO toasted in a chandelier-lit ballroom over a $1.8 billion contract. The quiet single father stood completely alone on the shop floor. He was busy coaxing a failing line controller back from a thermal meltdown that no one else could have caught. He logged his final critical warning report at 4 in the morning. Then he accepted a long-ignored invitation to travel to Stuttgart and quietly powered down his work phone before his plane left the gate. 50 days later, Nolan returned to Cleveland to find an empty parking lot, a crashing company stock price, and a factory that had practically stopped breathing. If you and I know that the overlooked people no one invites are keeping everything from falling apart, stick with me, because that quiet collapse was only just beginning. The invitations went out on a Thursday, and by Friday morning almost every single desk had a cream-colored envelope. The catering team, the front desk workers, even the 2 new technicians who started 3 weeks earlier, who still had to ask where the restrooms were. Blackthorne Mobility had secured a massive supply contract worth $1.8 billion with one of the biggest electric vehicle manufacturers in the nation. And Vivienne Blackthornne decided that this milestone deserved a massive celebration to match its scale. That meant a rooftop ballroom in downtown Cleveland, an open bar, and executive speeches long enough to fill the entire evening. Floor supervisor Marcus Bellamy, who worked with Nolan for 11 years, noticed his absence almost immediately. Not because he was actively looking for it, but because the exact name he expected to see in the credits simply was not there. Not on an envelope, not in the official program, and not on the guest list. He found Nolan in the break room that night, quietly pulling on his work jacket. His phone was already flashing a thermal warning from the main assembly controller. And when Marcus finally told him about the missing invite, Nolan stood entirely still for a second, then nodded and said there was a drywall emergency to handle. It turned out Preston Caldwell, the chief operating officer, had personally reviewed the list and crossed a line right through Nolan's name, deciding that a quiet maintenance man carried zero executive relevance to their massive new contract, a decision that ignored the reality that a massive part of the technical design specs used to win that deal had come straight from the documents Nolan had quietly written and submitted under his team header. His daughter Emery, an 18-year-old student currently finishing her first semester in mechanical design, had called her father that afternoon, telling him flat out that a company refusing to put his name on their guest list had absolutely no claim on his hard work or conscience that night. Nolan thanked her, hung up his phone, and drove straight to the plant. He spent the next 4 hours carefully recalibrating a failing thermal press that had begun introducing tiny microvariances into the component tolerances at a dangerous rate, invisible to anyone who had not spent years memorizing exactly how that machine behaved under load. And by midnight, the production line was stable. A batch of components that would have shipped with latent defects was flagged, saved by the man she ignored. Nolan silently slid a warning report right into Marcus's tray, noting the quick fix was only temporary, and that the real issue required a firmware review he had requested 4 times. He quietly stepped outside. Marcus followed him out, showing him a photo on his phone. There was Vivienne Blackthornne at the center of a sparkling room, glass raised, surrounded by every director and manager, celebrating their supposed win. All of them smiling, absolutely sure they had built something incredible. Nolan stared at their happy faces for a long moment, then returned the phone in silence. Right then, his own phone lit up with a message from Stuttgart. This email from Kessler Work Automation had been waiting 72 hours, sent directly to him instead of the general company inbox, because the German engineers knew from experience that routing to Blackthorne's management meant sending it into silence. The program was a 50-day residency for top systems specialists, integration experts, but their chosen nominee was a regional operations director picked by Preston just to sound impressive. He canceled 10 days before leaving, claiming a schedule conflict that everyone knew had more to do with his absolute terror of technical German discussions than any actual calendar issue. Nolan had quietly applied for the residency 3 months ago. He filled out the nomination form with a note explaining that the Kessler calibration methodology was the exact fix for the system calibration errors he kept flagging since spring. But Preston had returned the PLU application with a blunt note saying this program required a candidate who could represent their brand at an executive level. Yet this new German message told Nolan his slot remained open. His name stood out to their engineers during a technical review of documents Blackthornne had shared. And if he was interested, their coordinator needed a final answer before 8 a.m. He read it twice, then went home. Sat at his kitchen table for an hour and drafted 4 files. First, a formal request for 50 days of unpaid leave for HR. Second, an 11-page handover memo to guide Marcus and Eliza through the chaos. Third, a list of 7 massive operational risks to watch during his absence, complete with the exact threshold limits that should trigger an immediate escalation. Finally, a brief note telling Emery he was leaving for Germany and to call him for anything. Nolan submitted his leave request at 5:45 in the morning. He drove to the factory to hand Marcus the keys to the critical system files, then walked Eliza through the full handover in person. He told both of them clearly that if the production line showed any variance on his list, they must bypass Preston entirely and contact the German manufacturer directly. He had already written down the contact name at Kessler Work. Preston approved the leave request in under 40 minutes, operating under the foolish belief that Nolan was just throwing a tantrum and would return to his desk within a week. Vivienne barely blinked at the brief notice about her quietest maintenance engineer. He was taking unpaid leave for professional development, completely on his own. She never even asked for details. Before his plane even reached cruising altitude, Marcus sent a quick text. Preston immediately ordered the assembly line back to full operating speed, overriding the cautious slowdown protocol Nolan had quietly run for 6 weeks. For the first 7 days, everything seemed completely fine. Eliza Monroe was studying the handover notes, trying to hold things together. She managed the floor with the basic competence of someone who knows how to keep things moving. But she was not experienced enough to know which of its daily quirks were normal and which were silent warning signs building up beneath the surface. She caught 3 small system alerts during that first week, checking them against Nolan's detailed notes. She quietly solved all 3 without calling for help. This quick success gave her a false confidence, something she later called the most dangerous feeling she ever had. The strange sensation of managing a machine she did not truly understand, with nothing immediately breaking as a result. Preston stood in Vivienne's office on day 5, boasting that Nolan's sudden departure proved the factory did not depend on any single quiet man. And Vivienne, who was completely juggling calls with her big institutional investors, thrilled by the massive contract news, accepted that assessment blindly because it perfectly matched the grand story she wanted to tell about their operational maturity. Production numbers that week actually surged well past their previous baseline. But this was only because Preston pushed the machinery to full speed while quietly skipping 2 critical quality checks that Nolan had carefully built into the routine, a shortcut that simply boosted short-term figures while erasing any warning signs of the severe structural stress building up inside the parts moving through the heavy press. Meanwhile, in Stuttgart, Nolan stood in front of the most advanced calibration machine he had ever seen in his career. He watched a German engineer demonstrate an adjustment sequence that instantly explained 3 mysterious quirks he had observed in the Blackthornne assembly line for years and could never fully explain. He felt the deep satisfaction of a complex question finally being answered after years of searching for the truth. Dr. Graham Fallner, who managed the partnership program and had spent 30 years working between American factories and precision German engineering shops, studied Nolan during the demonstration, with the careful eye of someone who recognized a very rare breed of engineer. Not the loud know-it-all, but the quiet specialist who has lived with a machine so long it became a language he was already translating into his thoughts at the speed of a native speaker. On day 7, a regular customer sent a routine field report back to the Blackthornne quality assurance team, reporting that 3 crucial prototype modules had completely failed their long-term stress test. breaking after just 200 hours, only half of their expected lifespan. The quality team forwarded Nolan's hidden report to Preston. He filed it away, hiding Nolan's work from the dismissive CEO Vivienne. On day 9, Eliza spotted the hidden anomaly. Initially, it appeared to be a simple sensor calibration drift, the exact kind of common glitch usually fixed in under an hour. She opened the detailed notes of Nolan, the quietest man in the company, finding this exact behavior described 7 pages in. A compound variance. This pattern appeared when ambient temperatures exceeded 78 degrees Fahrenheit, and the primary sensor array had run over 40 hours without manual offset corrections, producing parts that passed every automated quality check during manufacturing, though they were statistically doomed to fail after 150 to 250 hours of use. Nolan's note mapped out the recommended fix and a clear inspection schedule. He had clearly highlighted that this issue required a complete controller firmware update and a total sensor recalibration to ever be resolved permanently. Eliza brought this warning to Preston, requesting a 12% slowdown to schedule the critical maintenance. But Preston insisted that slowing down would drop them below their weekly output target, demanding that she protect the new contract by finding a way to skew the quality sampling protocol to keep the warning signs beneath the smile red line that would trigger an automatic alert in their system. Marcus overheard the entire argument from across the room. He walked over and snapped that faking the numbers to hide a defect wasn't a solution. Preston snapped that Marcus was free to take the night shift if he didn't like how things were run, making it clear his decision was final. Desperate, Eliza emailed Vivienne's assistant directly, begging the busy CEO to review Nolan's critical technical findings. But the system routed her email to the cluttered facilities queue, where Nolan's warnings were completely lost, burying the urgent alert under low-priority tickets. While Vivienne paraded around Germany, Graham pulled files from Stuttgart's database, handing the ignored Nolan a printed report to confirm the truth, whether it was actually Blackthorne's data, because the unique methodology was so distinctive and the production signatures so familiar. Even though they had erased Nolan's name from his own work, crediting a generic team instead. Nolan quietly confirmed it was his, and Graham then showed him another document. A critical technical advisory that the manufacturer had issued 6 months ago to everyone using their thermal press, specifically urging a critical firmware update to fix the known sensor drift issue caused by high ambient conditions, which was sent to every registered contact. At the bottom of the acknowledgement log, one familiar name stood out: Preston Caldwell. Then, the formal rejection of their shipment arrived on Tuesday. A massive carrier returning 16 full pallets of Blackthorne parts. The client's quality team had run their own incoming tests. The actual inspection showed a staggering 14% reject rate on that batch. That was 7 times their allowed contractual defect limit. Preston spent 3 hours typing up an internal report that shifted blame. It called the disaster a temporary hiccup caused by the sudden shift in maintenance leadership. Then he sent that cover-up report straight to Vivienne, warning her about the terrible risks of letting a vital, quiet engineer leave without forcing him to hand over his secrets first. It was a neat trick to lay all the blame on Nolan, leaving, completely hiding Preston's own terrible choices while he was gone. Vivienne blew up Nolan's phone all afternoon with 4 desperate calls, but the quiet father, who was busy running a critical calibration at the Kessler lab for 3 visiting engineers who had driven 3 long hours just to learn from him, simply did not answer. Seeing the missed alerts that night, he calmly sent a brief email response. The warning for this exact technical failure was detailed in his handover notes, right on page 4, while the fix was spelled out on page 7. Eliza and Marcus had both the power and the clear instructions to halt the line to inspect it, suggesting the company contact the Kessler worky technical team directly, rather than waiting for him to run a factory floor from across the ocean. Vivienne reread his short message 3 times, and with every single pass, she felt that same uncomfortable realization. Nolan was not wrong. In fact, his being absolutely right exposed a harsh truth she had tried so hard to ignore. Preston warned the leadership team the next morning, insisting that the cold email proved Nolan had walked away from his duties, exploiting their current manufacturing crisis for personal gain. He even suggested that if the quiet engineer refused to come back, the board should investigate if his departure violated his official contract terms. Conrad Blackthornne, the powerful board chairman who had spent months pushing for a deal since last spring, desperate to inflate the company's total valuation before their upcoming corporate merger, phoned Preston right after that high-stakes executive meeting, ordering him to sweep this under the rug and keep those awful failure rates hidden from their weekly investor reports. Back in his quiet Stuttgart apartment, Nolan called his daughter Emery, who listened in silence to his story. Once he finished, she spoke softly. "Dad, they only ever call you when everything breaks." He nodded, knowing she was right. She added, "Then you already know exactly what to do." They spent the rest of the hour talking about his daughter's life instead. The next morning at Kessler, a formal name placard was set out in the meeting room. When Nolan walked inside and noticed it, he paused to read the text twice. Nolan Pierce, Lid Systems Specialist, Blackthornne Mobility. He gently lifted the card, telling the coordinator that this fancy title was wrong, clarifying that he was just a senior maintenance engineer. The coordinator looked truly surprised by this, explaining they simply copied the title straight from the official files. Graham, who was just nearby listening, observed the moment in silence, then noted softly that most of their key guides had been written by Nolan himself. Two major European manufacturers had already cited his breakthrough in their official papers. They adopted his smart calibration design, and his master methodology was now being praised across the engineering world as the actual solution to critical thermal press errors in high-volume precision manufacturing. Graham pulled up a stack of official reports sent by the company over the previous 3 years, showing Nolan that his brilliant work was credited to a faceless integration team. It was just a generic corporate department label, not an actual team, ensuring that every bit of praise and corporate credit and financial bonuses from his work went directly into the COO's pockets. 2 days later, the official offer from Kessler arrived. A director position, complete control, and the power to build his own dream team. 3 times his current salary plus full relocation expenses paid, and a generous scheduling setup that let him stay in the States until Emery completed her degree before moving to Germany on his own terms. Nolan studied the life-changing offer, then quietly set it aside. He took a long, quiet walk along the river, and when he returned, he admitted he needed time to think. He wanted to make this choice based on his actual dreams, not because he was furious at the company that had exploited his silent labor. Right now, his anger and his career goals were completely tangled. Graham asked him one simple question. Did the employer he wanted to protect ever show him that same loyalty? Nolan nodded, truly appreciating the hard question. But blind loyalty to a cold corporation was not what made him hesitate to sign. Instead, he felt responsible for the factory floor workers who were stuck in a mess only his quiet genius could solve. Those innocent workers did not deserve to suffer for management's greedy mistakes. Vivienne was busy revising her latest investor slide deck when her assistant placed a mysterious folder on her desk, warning her that she needed to review these documents before speaking to investors. Inside was the original unedited VIP guest list, the massive corporate gala, and pinned to the very front was a damning note. A manager had submitted Nolan's name for the elite celebration 3 different times, begging for him to be included. Vivienne flipped to the final, approved version of the list. There, Nolan's name was aggressively crossed out in red ink, with a cruel note handwritten by Preston in the margin. Just maintenance staff, no executive relevance. Stunned, she stared at the paper before digging up years of employee reviews and records. She reviewed project logs, engineering awards, and the massive payouts from the last 3 years. What she uncovered was a sickening pattern of theft that was painful to look at once understood. 3 massive production emergencies over the past 4 years had ended with huge cash bonuses for the executive team. Yet every single crisis had actually been solved by Nolan's brilliant technical fixes. But the credit went to a fake team name, which she finally realized was just a fake label Preston used on documents to steal credit for himself, completely erasing the quiet man who kept the factory running. That night, she dialed Nolan directly from her personal phone. When the quiet genius picked up, she admitted she finally saw the truth about his exclusion. She apologized for excluding him, but the quiet man simply replied that the party was not the issue. It just helped me realize where I truly stood. When she asked what he meant, he explained that they only noticed his existence when the machinery broke down. That is when you finally understand your true value to them. And that silent realization was incredibly eye-opening. She was still reeling from his words when her phone buzzed with a sudden alert from their bank. Their vital credit facility was suspended pending an immediate review. It was triggered by their biggest client stating they were pausing the entire contract until the quality issues were resolved. On day 30, Vivienne went down to the factory floor completely unannounced. She walked through the struggling plant and wore the fancy clothes she had chosen for a board lunch. They were totally wrong for the greasy floor, but she ignored her discomfort. What she saw was a far cry from the perfect reports she usually received. 2 of the 4 main assembly lines were dead silent. Defective parts were piled 3 pallets high against the wall, awaiting inspection. 2 idle technicians sat in the break room at 11 in the morning because their work was canceled and nobody told them to leave. At a nearby workstation, Eliza Monroe held a printed calibration sheet, looking completely defeated with an expression of panic that Vivienne recognized from her worst days. Marcus pulled the CEO into his office and shut the door. He dropped a thick binder containing every shift log and maintenance request on the desk. Every single alert the quiet engineer Nolan had sent over 8 months about the failing thermal press. These were not the sanitized updates she had been shown. They were the raw files packed with alarming details. They contained urgent warnings that her senior staff had quietly deleted. Eliza walked Vivienne through the technical breakdown using Nolan's handover notes. She explained that the compounding error Nolan had caught and kept running manually for 6 months was never a secret. It was a heavily documented issue featured in dozens of formal requests. Preston had either buried the warnings or stripped them of all urgency. In the emergency meeting, Vivienne demanded to know why the executive reports she received always claimed the production quality was safe, when the actual factory floor data showed total disaster. Preston lamely claimed the technical crew was just exaggerating standard machine issues as a massive systemic crisis to cover for Nolan's exit and protect their former colleague. Then the chief financial officer, Genevieve, spoke up. She pulled up the soaring warranty claim data right there. She revealed that the real cost of defective components returned by clients was already $41 million over budget, and losing that key contract would ruin them. The company would instantly default on its major bank loans. This gave their bank the right to demand immediate repayment. As Vivienne drove home that night, she searched her old emails for the final report Nolan sent before leaving. On page 1, under the risk summary, was a direct warning from the quiet man she had ignored. Without slowing the line speed down and failing to apply the calibration corrections, untracked engineering defects will accumulate, triggering massive product failures within 30 to 45 days of this report. Vivienne called Nolan the very next morning, begging him to return, but he had just one demand, and it had absolutely nothing to do with a bigger paycheck or a fancy title. It was purely operational. Had they actually slowed down the line speed? Did they call Kessler for technical support, halted shipping unverified parts, and finally revealed the true failure rates to their clients completely and honestly? She admitted the board refused to allow that and that Conrad had ordered Preston to keep shipping parts while they handled it quietly. Nolan made it clear that, under those conditions, he was completely useless to her. She was just asking him to go back, slap on a temporary bandage, buy them 3 weeks, and repeat this exact same nightmare. And he had already spent years realizing that quick fixes on broken systems are never real solutions. They just delay the inevitable, making the final crash far worse. Vivienne claimed she understood his stance, but pleaded that people's jobs were on the line. Nolan calmly told her he knew. But those livelihoods were endangered the second Preston ignored the line speed warnings on day 1. The real threat to those jobs was the person who overrode the engineering advice, not the quiet engineer who wrote it, only to be told he wasn't wanted. Graham had offered to dispatch a free Kessler support team directly to the Blackthorne plant as a partner benefit, but only if they agreed to an independent safety audit. And Vivienne accepted the deal before she even phoned Nolan. But Conrad immediately killed the idea in an emergency board meeting, claiming that letting an external company audit their factory would tell investors that they couldn't even guarantee their own manufacturing standards. This was exactly what Conrad feared most, especially since his secret buyout talks relied entirely on the buyer believing their factory output was flawless and secure. After hanging up, Nolan sent Vivienne a final blunt text containing just one short sentence. "Tell the customer the truth first, then you can call me." Vivienne spent 3 agonizing days locked in boardrooms and legal debates, and on tense calls with the client's operations. By the end of that marathon, she went completely rogue, doing 4 things Conrad explicitly forbade. First, she sent the client's managers a totally unredacted, brutally honest file on the defect, detailing the origin, the timeline, and the exact executive choices that allowed the bad parts to ship. Second, she stripped Preston Caldwell of his duties, launching an immediate investigation. She formally accepted the Kessler partnership proposal for an outside audit, promising the team's raw data would go straight to the customer. Finally, she ordered her accounting team to block all shipments until the inspectors cleared the inventory. Conrad immediately demanded an emergency board meeting. He told the directors that Vivienne had single-handedly destroyed the company's negotiating power, ruined their customer relationship, and let outsiders access highly confidential production data. He accused her of firing a senior boss illegally, demanding she be suspended as CEO immediately. But Genevieve warned the board that doing nothing, continuing to ship defective products while lying to their biggest client, created massive unfixable legal risks so severe that no standard executive insurance policy would ever cover them. She argued that Conrad's cover-up plan wasn't a strategy, just a delay of an even bigger disaster. The board delayed the vote, giving themselves 48 hours to decide. Meanwhile, the angry client warned Blackthorne that without a real recovery plan in 5 days, they would kill the contract and hand everything over to their lawyers. That 5-day window closed on the exact day Nolan finished his training program in Germany. Nolan landed in Cleveland on a gray Tuesday morning and grabbed a car from the Beep airport, skipping the calls. He had to see the factory floor before making any decisions. The company parking lot was ghost town empty at 9 in the morning. For a facility supposedly running round-the-clock shifts, this was a terrible sign. The massive banner celebrating their $1.8 billion contract and boasting about American manufacturing had been torn down, leaving only 4 faded spots on the brick where the sign once hung. Nolan stood by the gate, checking his phone, when Vivienne pulled up and stepped out of her car to meet him. She wasn't dressed like a powerful executive today. She wore working clothes, looking like she'd been on the factory floor since dawn, because she had. Without saying a word, she handed him a folder containing 5 critical documents: the full disclosure letter, and the suspension papers for the executive who had excluded him, a formal audit request sent to Kessler Work, approved orders to immediately cut production speeds down to the safe levels Nolan had originally begged for, and a pledge to rebuild the engineering department from scratch, giving the quiet engineers power to stop assembly lines when quality failed. She quietly admitted she did exactly what he wanted before even calling. Nolan studied every page, looked up at the CEO, and agreed to help. When Graham Fallner and 4 elite Kessler Work engineers pulled up at the plant 2 hours later, the quiet genius walked in with them, not as a submissive worker but as their independent advisor. A critical distinction, because it meant the corrupt executives could never bury his final report to protect their own careers. His very first demand, upon stepping onto the factory floor, was the complete calibration logs from the last 45 days. Next, he demanded the precise baseline data he had manually updated before she forced him out. But Marcus whispered, nervously, telling the team they needed to see something before taking another step: the calibration records for the last 6 months, along with the crucial reference data that made the entire facility work, had been completely wiped out. This was no accidental file corruption. The server logs proved a deliberate manual deletion. It was run from Preston's account 4 days after Nolan left for Germany at 2:14 a.m., followed immediately by an overwrite, a targeted command to the backup partition, destroying the last hope of a quick system recovery. When the board's legal counsel finally reached Preston by phone, he claimed no memory of it, suggesting instead that the missing data had been deleted by Nolan himself, trying to make his quiet presence seem indispensable. But the access log shattered that lie. Within 20 minutes, proving Nolan's last login was nothing more than a routine shift log at 11:47 p.m. the night before his flight. The tech team spent 3 desperate hours trying to rebuild the reference curve from indirect data, digging through scattered quality system records and raw outputs from the automated sampler, sifting through the press controller's configuration files until Eliza, who had been sitting in total silence, watching the reconstruction run on her screen, paused and announced she had to check something in the back storage room. She remembered a training session from 8 months ago with the quiet engineer. Nolan had connected a standalone diagnostic tablet directly to the press controller to save a solid baseline before the software update went live. He silently saved a local copy for insurance, warning her that their systems couldn't be trusted. The server backup was too unreliable, so he shelved that tablet when the job was done. It lay forgotten, never decommissioned by the management that overlooked him. They found it inside a plastic bin, tucked under a steel shelf deep in the parts closet. Still charged to 62% and the data was intact. But the quiet man didn't gloat or treat this as personal vindication. He simply handed the tablet to Eliza, telling her to verify the files and start rebuilding. Then he took the floor layout and quietly divided the remaining diagnostic tasks into structured tracks. Eliza would reconstruct the error curve, while Marcus managed the floor crews. The Kessler engineers were tasked with assessing the hardware, while Nolan silently took charge of the integration layer. He messaged Vivienne, the CEO, who had ignored him, explaining the data was safe and a recovery plan was ready, but warning her that restoring a line is a far cry from actually certifying it. And true certification would require tossing every single part made during the high-variance window. Conrad called the board meeting for 11 p.m. He arrived holding a drafted resolution designed to instantly strip Vivienne of her executive power. It would temporarily reinstate Preston and keep shipping products using their flawed old protocols, choosing hostile arbitration with their client over making things right voluntarily. He read the resolution aloud, explaining every corrupt clause with the smooth, polished ease of a man who spent decades dressing up reckless corporate greed as responsible management. When he wrapped up, he smiled, looked around, and invited discussion. Vivienne delivered her defense without any drama. She placed the evidence on the table, piece by piece in strict chronological order, starting with Nolan's maintenance request from 8 months ago, and ending with the server log showing the exact deletion time and Preston's account name. Let's look at how she explained the documents, exposing what the company actually knew, exactly when they knew and who hid the truth, along with the brutal damage caused by their silence. Genevieve laid out the massive financial risks just as bluntly. If the client sued, the real damage was $60 to $90 million. With insurance capping at $40 million, the massive remaining gap would have to come from company equity, and the chairman's plan would make that gap even larger. Then came Nolan, the quietest man, speaking very briefly. He noted that the CEO had made choices he never expected from her, but he wanted the board to understand the weight of her recent decisions. Choosing to confess to the client early had cost them real money and reputation, but he knew it was the only path that saved them from a slow, managed failure. Eliza Monroe spoke last, addressing the room directly. She wanted them to consider a truth not found in any official reports: why they relied so heavily on this quiet man's manual fixes for years. It wasn't because he wanted to make himself indispensable. It was because every single time he tried to build a real system, they deprioritized it for output targets. The company's real vulnerability wasn't the absence of this single father, but the lack of a system that valued technical integrity as a priority instead of an obstacle. The board voted that night, suspending the arrogant chairman pending a full review. Preston was fired while Vivienne managed to keep her position as CEO by a single vote, while the client extended their window by 2 days. The next 4 days inside Blackthorne saw the most intense work this quiet father had led in 11 years. The big difference this time was that their quietest leader ran the entire crisis with total transparency. Every single employee on the floor knew exactly what to do. They understood why their work mattered and how success was measured. Nolan set up a massive whiteboard at the entrance, dividing the work into 4 clear tracks: testing the hardware, reconstructing error curves, system integration, and handling client communication. Every single track had a clear lead and a backup. Every update went up in real time, so no crucial details stayed locked inside just one person's head. Eliza worked straight through the night, reconstructing the complex error curve by sunrise. She did it with enough precision for the field engineers to recalibrate the massive production press. When she explained her brilliant new method during the morning briefing, Nolan stopped the meeting to address the room. He told everyone that her method was far faster and more accurate than anything he could have designed. He insisted she get full, official credit as the author. The precision recalibration took almost 2 full days. Validation testing took most of the 3rd day, and by the morning of the 4th, Graham signed the official certification, confirming the production line was running flawlessly again. The client dispatched an inspection team to watch a live run. It passed every single test they threw at it, and by late afternoon the client agreed to stay, proving the quietest man saved them. Even though they had to slash production volume by 30% for the next 6 months as a condition for staying in business, and the massive penalty for their quality failure was paid in full, totaling $28 million for ruined components and repair costs. It was a blow heavy enough to sting, yet small enough that they could survive without defaulting on their bank loans. Vivienne told the board they had barely survived, and survival was exactly the right word for it, meaning the real challenge now was what they would actually do with this second chance. Because if the only lesson they learned from those 50 days was to give their quietest, most essential engineer a raise and a fancier title, then they had completely missed the point. 6 months slowly flew by. Preston Caldwell was fired after an inquiry proved he had deleted crucial calibration files, manipulated the quality testing methods, hid serious warnings from the board, and stolen credit for the quiet engineer's brilliant technical work. Conrad Blackthorne was forced off the board when the internal probe exposed secret merger talks he had been running on the side. These secret terms would have handed him a massive payout, but only if the company's valuation stayed above a limit that the real, honest production numbers would have ruined. The entire engineering division was rebuilt so that quality control managers reported straight to the board about factory safety issues and held total power to slow down or completely stop assembly lines if quality dropped. A new cross-training program was launched, making sure every single vital process was mastered by at least 3 workers and written down without needing a manager's permission. But Nolan refused to return as a regular employee. Instead, he launched his own consulting firm, calling the shots for both major companies. He chose his own projects and hired a specialized team of 6 engineers. This time his name went proudly on every single report. Then Vivienne planned a celebration right on the factory floor. No fancy hotels, no exclusive rooftop ballrooms. Just the warehouse break room packed with long tables and local takeout. The staff chose the food, and the guest list started with the cleaning crew and ended with the newly restructured board, listing everyone else in between without any corporate hierarchy or ranking. The quiet engineer's name sat proudly at the very top. Marcus wrote it himself, and this time nobody dared to cross him out. Nolan showed up in his usual work gear, giving quiet nods to his coworkers. He quietly took a seat near the back, and as Vivienne stood up to address them, she didn't mention profit margins, corporate strategy, or elite family legacies. Instead, she admitted they had wasted a whole year, realizing that a factory floor does not run on executive ego or money. It runs entirely on the quiet heroes who work silently behind the scenes, doing the vital jobs that keep the whole system from collapsing. And she acknowledged they were incredibly lucky to have someone like him who cared. even if they had not always deserved his silent, world-saving dedication. She loudly thanked Marcus, Eliza, the Kessler team, and the floor technicians all by name. And she thanked Nolan last. And she did not call him indispensable or the savior who had rescued the entire company, because he had asked her not to. And because she finally understood why putting everything on a single quiet pillar was dangerous. After the gathering, Vivienne handed Nolan a sealed envelope. Inside was a formal offer to represent the merged firm at an international manufacturing summit in Stuttgart. He read it slowly, then asked if anyone had checked if there was a higher-ranking executive available to go in his place. She smiled and replied that while there might be, nobody had earned the opportunity more than him. Nolan agreed, but only on one condition. Eliza would co-present with her name billed first, and Vivienne agreed before he could even finish speaking. They walked out of the facility together, stepping into the freezing November air. And Vivienne admitted she was deeply sorry it took a near collapse to finally see the quiet man who kept them alive. But Nolan replied that the party was not the real wound. The pain was 10 years of a company that only remembered he existed when things broke. Yet the snub was useful, clarifying a harsh truth his quiet loyalty had long refused to see. Namely, that silent goodwill, given to a company that forgets you exist until they need you, is not loyalty. It is just a habit, and habits can change. She softly asked if there was something beyond work they might be allowed to explore. He replied that he never made promises about things he could not yet verify, but he was open to finding out. He suggested they begin with a coffee the following morning at a quiet diner near the plant where nobody would ask for any speeches. He paused for a moment before stepping into his car, looking back at the brick building he had entered for 11 long years. The very business that had casually excluded him, only to nearly stop breathing the second he stopped working in the shadows to save it. And yet he felt no bitter anger and no triumph. Only the deep, quiet relief of a man who stopped measuring his value by whether his name made a guest list. He was returning not to carry the entire weight of the place on his shoulders, but to help build a system that never needed one quiet man standing alone in the dark to keep it from collapsing entirely.